Thank you very much. It's true. While being an authoritarian or totalitarian personality, I always follow the rules, I always follow the instructions. So if we speak about post, then I'm going to deal with this, but I'm going to speak English. I'd love to mention this from the very beginning.
Speaking about different meanings of the word post, let me begin by indicating the line between the Western postmodernist and East European post-socialist art. Western postmodernism was a reaction against the modernist canon, against the emergence of the new modernist salon and new rules of production and appreciation of art. In other words, against the academization of modernism. Indeed, in the middle of 1970s, the modernist canon dominated the art museums, institutions of art education, art market, art history, and critique. The goal of postmodernism that emerged during the late 70s and 80s was to rehabilitate everything that was repressed and excluded by this canon. Certain type of figuration, Italian trasavanguardia, German neo-expressionism, photography, cinema, performance, etc. The same can be said about the architectural postmodernism or literary postmodernism, rehabilitating the literary trash of all kinds. But the emergence of this type of postmodernism was impossible in the Eastern Europe, because the conditions under which art was practiced there were completely different. The modernist canon was never established and institutionalized in the Eastern Europe, so that the revolt against it had no sense. Even as modernist trends were allowed in some countries of the Eastern Europe, they did not have the same normative power as in the West. Here I mean the normative power supported by the internationally acting art institutions, big money, etc. The post-socialist art that emerged in the Soviet Union and other socialist countries in 70s and 80s also broke certain taboos. But they were not aesthetic taboos related to modernist high art canon. Rather, they were political taboos. It is enough to look at the Soviet and official art of the 70s to see the difference. In the works of artists of the Russian Soc art and Moscow Conceptualism, these works tried, at least symbolically, to erase actually the line of the Cold War that was dividing the East and the West. These works embodied in a certain utopian dream, the dream of détente, and ultimately of cultural unification of the ideologically divided world. In this sense, the post-socialist or post-communist art preceded and announced the end of the Cold War. In fact, Western postmodernism also had its own utopian dimension. Postmodernism privileged reproduction versus production, secondarity versus originality, anonymity versus individuality. The famous death of the author was no less utopian than the modernist search for a genius. Postmodernism dreamed of infinite flows of desire and information. The word infinite and infinite flow is already utopian, of course, in Deleuze, or infinite work of deconstruction is also on Derrida. So this infinity was completely utopian and maybe even neo-theological. And also celebrated hive mind or crowd mind that had to substitute the individual intelligence. Today, the Cold War is long over, so the question is allowed, do we live in the utopia promised to us by the Western postmodernism and Eastern post-socialism? One can doubt it. Today we live in the age of globalization and the internet. Both are effects of the end of the Cold War and the erasure of the ideological divide between the West and the East. However, instead of producing the infinite flows of desired information that were supposed to undermine and ultimately to kill the modernist subject of self-reflection, the internet delivered us to the almost unlimited power of algorithmically organized surveillance and control by the others. Contemporary globalization is in this sense a direct opposite to the modern or modernist ideal of internationality, of universality. And I would suggest that this ideal was somehow undermining, or is underpinning still the post-socialist art and the ideology of detente in general. The world of globalization is not a world of international solidarity or shared cultural values. Globalization is also not a realm of anonymous crowd mind. Actually, it is a world of global competition of everybody against everybody. So globalization is the opposite of the universality. It's a realm of total competition, expanded field of competition. This competition pushes the subject into who participate in it into the necessity to mobilize one's own human capital. I use this human capital from the, of course, neoliberal ideology, but also from its interpretation by Michel Foucault. And Michel Foucault describes human capital as being primarily the cultural heritage that is mediated by family and milieu in which an individual grown up. That is why the contemporary logic of globalization, unlike the internalization of universalization of the modernist type, leads to cultural conservatism and insistence on one's own cultural identity. The combination between globalization and extreme cultural conservatism defines the atmosphere, cultural atmosphere of our time. My Western colleagues ask me from time to time, how are the Russians and Eastern European artists doing? Did they already move on from the communist and post-communist times? This question actually means, have they already forgotten repressions and traumas of communism and become what they already always were, Polish, Slovenian, or Russians? Thus, for the Eastern European artist and Russian artist, to move on means, in fact, to go back. Back to the national cultural identity before it was repressed and distorted by communism. Here the question emerges, of course, how far they have to go back to be able to rediscover and reappropriate the cultural capital. Obviously, Russians have to go at least to 1916, maybe to 1913. That means that on the way to post-communist normalization and globalization, they have to abandon and subtract from the, let's say, cultural bank account almost the whole 20th century. The situation of other post-socialist countries is not so dramatic. They have to go back merely to the period before the World War II. But they still lose several decades. And in terms of cultural capital, under the conditions of international competition, is this not so negligent amount of time. Thus today the old line between the West and the East re-emerges in different forms. The West is not supposed to subtract certain periods of its cultural history from its cultural capital. Maybe the only exclusion here is the German art of Nazi time. This produces obvious inequality in conditions of cultural accumulation and capitalization. However, on the level of official cultural policies, this Western point of view is adopted also by the Eastern European country. The culturally conservative discourse currently dominates the public scene in Russia. But also in the Eastern European countries, communism is understood mostly as merely as damaging and interrupting the normal development of the national identity of each individual country. So what now emerges is a project of erasure of the remnants or leftovers communism, and with a goal to building capitalism, or to building national identity. And it very much reminds me of erasure of the remnants of capitalism in the 20s and 30s with a goal to building communism. So the Eastern European countries always practice erasure of leftovers, преодоление пережитков, преодоление пережитков. And erasure of remnants is precisely destruction of the cultural capital, because what is culture? It is a sum of пережитки, it is a sum of leftover remnants. It's actually a definition of culture. So if you erase пережитки, if you erase then nothing is able to пережить. If you erase all the пережитки, then you are confronted with immediate life, and culture is simply away. Okay, so that is a general condition. It's interesting that the same attitude towards Eastern Europe can be found in the contemporary ideology of left-wing Western intellectuals. This left-wing intellectuals believe that Russians and Chinese spoiled and destroyed the idea of communism. And so the idea of communism should be completely purified from all the remnants of its subversion, destruction, and betrayal by real communism in the Eastern Europe and Russia. Only after the communist idea is purified from the remnants of its false realization in the Eastern Europe and comes to its original purity, this idea can be rediscovered as an eternal utopia of the European mankind. So we have that strange alliance, which is almost identity between Western right-wing and left-wing attitude towards Eastern European and Russian experience. Both parts of the Western intellectual spectrum hate this experience for being a form of hybridization. What is a project of communism in one country as it was formulated by Stalin and then realized in different countries like Russia, China, Yugoslavia, so on and so on. That was a project of hybridization between universal idea of communism and national tradition of every particular country. As a good example of that, one can cite the reaction of Stalin. I learned that being at Beijing. The Beijing was designed by Soviet architects after the World War II, the new Beijing. As this project was shown to Stalin, he looked at them and said, well, they are really communist, but they are not national enough. And so on top of all these buildings were put small pagodas to make the authentic Chinese. So this kind of hybridization of communist universality and national particularity was this actual strategy of Eastern European and Russian communism. And that was precisely this hybridization that is a problem for contemporary Western set of mindset. So, because in the Western tradition, national identity exists on one side, and general idea of communism on the other side, were never mixed. This mixture between nationalism and communism that is so specific for the Eastern European and Asian post-communist country produced a new form of, I would say, folklorization of communism, what I mean. And also folklorization of the avant-garde. I mean that if in the West, people speaking about communism read Marx or Badiou, or let's say, speaking about avant-garde, they're thinking about MoMA and Tate Modern. In Russia, speaking about avant-garde and communism, they think about yellow blues of Mayakovsky, a red wedge that beats the white by Lisitsky, in the same context with the jokes about Chipaev and Pitka. It is a huge mass of folklore in which all these avant-garde figures and communist figures are integrated as a kind of national folklore of the 20th century. And I would suggest that is precisely the material for the Eastern European art of post-communist, post-socialist generation. It's not communism, it's not nationalism, it is hybrid folklorization of revolutionary avant-garde and idea of universal communism. It's very obvious in and programmatic in Irving Group. It's very obvious and programmatic in early Kabakov or Koma and Melamed. So it's all about this kind of new national/communist folklore. This use of folklore by art is romantic, it's called romanticism. So I think that we are living in a new age of romanticism. In general, we are back in the 19th century. Yeah? We are back in a situation after the collapse. Yeah? What was the 19th century? 19th century began after collapse of universal enlightenment and French Revolution and utopias of 70th and 80th century. What they left after the disappearance was a rich folklore of desire and horror, yeah, that was produced by the French Revolution and produced by 17th and 18th century in general. And that was precisely this folklore that was then used and exploited artistically by romantic art of the 19th century. Now we are back in the 19th century, so we are back in free markets, celebrity cult, and repressive and regressive cultural politics. That is precisely what was 19th century, that's precisely what 21st century is, and the relationship between our period and the period of early decades after Napoleonic War that had the same impact on the European culture as Cold War on the European culture in 20th century is obvious. So this new romanticism of the East maybe conforms the old prejudice that the Eastern German, East European, Middle Europe Germans are always romantic. Yeah. But I think it's not very bad to conform to prejudices. I think it's the best strategy, especially in culture. And it is a strategy that is obviously directed against the purification of communism and purification of national identities that are practiced all around the world. A nice, pleasant, and productive exception. Exceptionalism is also not so bad in culture. Maybe it's not so good in politics, but it's not so bad in culture. Thank you.